Good morning and welcome to Genus's monthly webinar. We're going to get going straight away here. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but I'd like to start with a quick land acknowledgement, extending our gratitude to the indigenous people, specifically the Musqueam, the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh, whose lands I'm coming to you from today. We do this to acknowledge the past and to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and our own understanding of local indigenous peoples and their cultures. Canada is home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to meet and work on this territory. So for those who don't know me, I am Grant Conroy, and I'll be hosting today's session. With me is Cindy Radu. There we go. Cindy is a family wealth transition advisor, helping individuals, family enterprises, business owners, and family offices navigate the complexities and opportunities that come with wealth. Cindy draws on over 35 years of legal, fiduciary, trust, and governance experience. And as she explained to me yesterday, she's dropped more letters after a name than most people tend to accumulate in a lifetime. Some of her achievements that stand out to me are that she's recently become the Chief Learning Officer for Tamarind Learning Canada. She's currently the chair of STEP Worldwide Business Families Global Steering Committee. And STEP is a global organization with over 30,000 members, for those that are not familiar. And in 2018, Cindy was awarded the prestigious Global STEP Private Client Awards, People's Choice Trusted Advisor of the Year. So she is very, very talented, and we're lucky to have her with us today. We've added links, or there should be links to both of our LinkedIn profiles in the chat, if you'd like to connect with us and make us feel more popular. So today, Cindy is going to be talking about how to stop Frankensteining it. This is going to cover how monsters are created as a bit of a case study, how family wealth transitions are more than just money, and how different approaches can achieve better outcomes. So before we jump in, just a few housekeeping items. If you want to maximize your screen for a better viewing experience, just hit the little square on the top right-hand corner of the browser, not the minus or the X, but the square. If you do have technical trouble, feel free to let us know in the chat and we'll try and help, but that tried and tested formula of just clicking out and exiting and then hitting the link again to come back in seems to work best most times. And finally, questions. If you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in the chat. There'll be a Q&A session at the end. Time permitting, we'll try and get through as many as possible, and we'll try and follow up on any of those that we don't manage to get through. So let's get started. Good morning, Cindy.
Good morning. It's great to be here, and I think we're going to start with a poll. Grant, do you want to take us into that poll?
Yeah, let's, there we go. So who is this an image of? And if you choose A, B, or C, and hopefully there are not many C answers. And a lot are coming in, and I think worryingly, there's a few people who have answered my Genus portfolio manager, given the recent market volatility. I'm hoping I brushed up a little bit better this morning, but it looks pretty close. So I'm hoping everyone can see these results, but Frankenstein is 37%, Frankenstein's monster is 57%, and there's still some answers coming in at the moment. So I'll let you take it away from
All right.
Cindy.
Well, thanks so much, Grant. And this is actually a really important point as we head into this. So this is indeed Frankenstein's monster, the monster that Frankenstein created. Grant, I'm not seeing, oh, there we are. And not Frankenstein himself. So what we're going to do here is we're going to meet Frankenstein in a minute, but just so everybody knows, Grant is going to be my eyes and ears. So I think we're going to be using the chat feature, and Grant's going to monitor that for items or questions or comments that he might want to interrupt me for, and he's very welcome to do that. This, I normally do this as a 3-hour workshop, so we are definitely speed dating today. So just so you have that context, that we're going to go through a whole bunch of concepts quite quickly. So hopefully we'll have some fun along the way. All right, so let's meet Frankenstein. This is Frank. His middle initial is N, and his last name is Stein. And as we can see, Frank's got a little thought bubble coming out of his head. He's done a bunch of work with his advisors and thinks he has created Michelangelo's David, but we can see that monster is lurking over his shoulder. So as Grant mentioned, the goals for today are we're going to look at what I call the brutal reality and why it happens. And then we're going to learn how these monsters get created. I call it the fun ways that things go wrong. We're going to meet Frank's family and see the monster and the whole Frankenstein method in action. But ultimately, what we want to realize is that there's ways to get better outcomes for families. Okay, so we're going to start with something I think many of you will be familiar with, the concept of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. And basically, generation 1 is represented here as the wealth creator generation. 100% of the wealth that generation 1 creates. The story goes that by end of generation 2, that wealth's depleted by 70%, and by generation 3, it's depleted by 90%. So the message that I want to give today is that these are historical stories that we tell, and the great news is that families are doing things differently, and a lot of families do beat these odds. So that's what we want to do. We want to be in that bucket that's beating these odds. There's also a study that's often cited about why these statistics happen, why we deplete wealth so quickly. And the sort of the veracity of this study, I think, is a little bit in question in terms of how robust it is. But basically what we see is there's 60% had been roughly attributed to breakdown in communication among family members, 25% because the rising generation hasn't been adequately prepared to inherit the wealth, another 10% for lack of vision, and only a very small sliver related to what people tend to focus on mostly, which is tax and financial planning. So whether these statistics are exactly right, don't get twisted about that. But I think the important point or message to take from this slide is that there's a lot more that we need to focus on than just the tax and financial planning. And so now what we have is this little slide here that says this lawsuit, what end of it am I going to be on? And unfortunately, we are seeing a significant trend in litigation, in estate litigation. And so much so, frankly, in Alberta, we have a new estate litigation division as of a couple of years ago. So just specifically a division in the courts that's dedicated to dealing with estate litigation. And I'm assuming that that's because they're seeing more and more estate litigation rather than less and less. So we need to be cognizant of these trends. I mean, you've had a very recent and very important case in BC at the BC Court of Appeal called Pirani. You've obviously also seen the Rogers kerfuffle out in Vancouver, for those of you who are there. But this litigation trend is all across the country. So let's have a look at how these monsters get created. So one of the things that for me is really important to look at is something that I call the family advisor focus disconnect. And Grant mentioned that I have quite a few designations, and actually the two that I dropped are the ones that you had on the opening slide. So I actually have dropped my FEA and I've dropped my FCPA. I've dropped a few other ones as well, but a number of designations, and I can't drop any degrees, but mostly different designations. But I have worked as my initial career was as a chartered accountant, became a tax and trust lawyer, worked as a tax and trust lawyer for many years. And so I have a rich background prior to the last 15 years, really, in tax, trust, estate planning, very technical, technical type of work, and working in a variety of environments. And consistently what I've seen over the last, I'd say 30, 35 years is this family advisor focused disconnect. So the family rarely actually knows the questions to ask. They don't know what they don't know. And they, as hopefully they would want to, is they put their faith and their trust in their advisor. But the advisor, on the other hand, is really focused on their particular lens and their skills that they bring to the table, because that's what they know. And what you start to get is a bit of an advisor family disconnect, because the family doesn't really know the questions to ask. And they're kind of in the background going, well, I wonder how this is really going to affect me and my family. But the advisors tend to be quite solution oriented and bringing you solutions that they know. So typically, for example, you'll go to maybe a tax accountant or a tax lawyer, and the answer is going to be an estate freeze without any real conversation. It's just going to be, yeah, you need to do an estate freeze. And I know because I used to do that. So I speak from personal experience. The other thing is that we need to be conscious of different perspectives among family members, as well as, again, between the advisors and the family. And we'll have a chance to touch on that a little bit more. The next point I want to make is I have often found that there's a lot of inertia and procrastination in really focusing on wealth transition planning. And for me, a lot of that comes from what I'll call the 4 C's. So one is people just don't like to spend money on advisors, right? So it's like, that's number one. And it's especially the way advisors bill. Many of us have billed in the past, which I don't personally anymore, but billing in 6-minute increments is really problematic, I think, from incentivizing doing this work really well. The other is, not wanting to impede cash flow. So sometimes I've had clients say, oh, I don't want to do an estate freeze because that's going to impact my cash flow. And it really shouldn't, but it's something that people can use as a bit of a reason to not proceed. Control is another one. Very rarely do people like to give up control, in my experience. And so, again, that's another reason to procrastinate. Generally, people don't like change, and they also tend to be conflict avoiders. So these are all very common reasons for not proceeding with a very robust type of wealth transition plan. And unfortunately, that can lead to some very unintended results. You get documents that you don't understand, structures you don't understand. That I've, in the last, I don't know how many, just say 15 years, whenever I've explained a structure to a family, they've never said, yeah, that's what we thought would happen, not in a single instance. And that's partly because documents and structures get kind of piecemealed together over time, but it's also because they actually really didn't understand them in the first place. They just start signing off on documents. So you get unanticipated outcomes, often after somebody has died or become incapacitated, when you can't do anything about it. So this whole idea of inertia and procrastination is one that we really need to get our minds past.
Cindy, could you just spend 30 seconds and very explaining what an estate freeze is in a very sort of simplistic, high level?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I wish I had a flip chart. Well, I do, but I'll just do it quickly, verbally. Basically what happens is families, usually mom and dad, kind of get to a point where they're at they think enough wealth, but the wealth is going to continue to grow over time, and they don't want to continue to have that wealth directed to them. They want to direct it to, or be more inclusive of other family members that could share in that upside. So essentially what you do is you take the common shares of an existing company, whether it's a holding company with, an investment portfolio or an operating business, it doesn't matter. And you value the company at a moment in time. Let's just say it's $20 million. So the common shares at that moment in time are worth $20 million. So what you do is then you issue what are called preferred shares, and preferred shares act like debt on your balance sheet. So what that does is if you looked at a balance sheet at that moment in time, you have $20 million of value, but you have these $20 million of preferred shares that offset that. So at that moment in time, the value of that company is nominal. And so new shareholders can come in and pay a nominal amount for the shares. And we do that because you don't want to have bad tax outcomes. So you have to pay fair market value for the shares. And often people don't have $20 million kicking around to invest in new shares of a company. So that's why we do that step. The shareholders that come in will often be mom and dad directly, but also it's usually a family trust that comes in and will own shares as well. And those will be common shares, and the features on those shares will vary between whether they're voting or non-voting. And what class of common shares there are. And that just gives a different flexibility if there's different classes of common shares, and really where you want the voting control to be will depend on the trustees. So that is like a really fast explanation of estate freezes.
Yeah. So I think effectively it takes a wealth, it freezes it in a point in time, and any future growth goes into a family trust or some entity that benefits the whole family as opposed to just mum and dad. And then it's so hopefully that answers the question. Feel free to
perfect. That's great. Okay, so then let's talk about this. Kind of goes back to one of the earlier slides where, you know, what are we really focusing on, and this technical piece. Well, the technical piece historically has been incredibly narrow in that it focuses really on business. And so again, we'll just call business, whether that's an operating entity or a holding company. But the reality is that families across all net worth brackets typically have an entire enterprise, right? So the enterprise is comprised of all these different types of assets. So you'll have often your principal residence, you might have one or more vacation properties, you may have other real estate like rental properties, your investment portfolio, insurance, other deferred assets like RRSPs or TFSAs, whatever those other assets are that you have. But for me, where things get really interesting is collections and heirlooms and jewelry. So one of the things is it probably takes me about 20 times to ask people, well, what else do you have? What else do you have? What else do you have? Before we actually figure out what all they have. But this collections and heirlooms and jewelry, people will go, oh, no, I don't. It's like everything I've got, it's really simple. And there's nothing that we have that's of a lot of value. And one of my favorite stories is a family that I was working with, and I asked them about collections, and they said, oh, no, we don't have anything like that. And so and then one of the brothers, there was two sisters and two brothers, and one of the brothers said, yeah, but what about dad's gun collection? And dad had just been moved into an assisted living facility, and the daughter who'd been taking care of him at home said, yeah, no, I sold that a couple of years ago. And the brother just about launched across the table at her about her selling the gun collection without talking to him. And then this evolved into another conversation about the white metal salt shaker with the red lid. So the conflict and the things that people are going to get twisted about often are relatively nominal financial value, but there's tremendous emotional value. And we have to be really cognizant of that. And then a lot of families either have some kind of philanthropic interest, whether it's a donor advised fund, some go all the way to a foundation. But for the most part, most families have some sort of philanthropic interest that we also need to be aware of and nurture. So I'm going to move now to what I call the silo problem. And this is something very near and dear to my heart. So I started out as a CPA. As a chartered accountant, and I worked actually as the controller of Bennett Jones, and I loved law. I was really interested in the law, and I went back to law school, and I practiced as a lawyer for many years at two law firms, Bennett Jones and another boutique tax firm. I also have worked in two of our big financial institutions, two of the large national banks, as well as starting a private trust company for a group of people. So I have worked in all of these different silos to various degrees. And I have a very different perspective because I have been on the inside out and the outside in. This silo problem really initiated the title for this presentation today, which is Stop Frankensteining It, because I have a friend whose name is Charlie. Charlie was buying the family business from his dad, had other siblings, nobody else was interested in the business. Everything was fair value, no conflict whatsoever. And still Charlie said, Cindy, I felt like I had to Frankenstein it. I didn't know who to go to for what. And I suspect this is an experience that many of people who are on this webinar today have had. And if I asked you, well, would you go to your tax accountant or your tax lawyer for this? You probably would hesitate and go, well, I'm not exactly sure. So when we look at the silos, we also have to recognize that there's silos within the silos. So if I take the legal one, which is the one I feel most comfortable with, so within legal, let's just take tax. Within a law firm, you could have tax, corporate, you can have litigation, you have subspecialties by industry, and on and on and on. But if we just go to tax, it's like, is it personal tax? Is it corporate tax? Is it cross-border tax? Is it scientific research tax? Is it estate freezes? What is your specialty? So these silos are really problematic because they don't collaborate. They cooperate and they work very much in what I'll call as a handoff, but true collaboration is incredibly rare in this work. And so what ends up happening is we have all these gaps and disconnects that, again, we don't find out until, unfortunately, sometime later on when either we can't do anything about it if we haven't been proactive, or for other reasons it might just be too late to change. So this gets exacerbated because in the next slide, you'll see that there's even more silos that we don't even think about. These are just the main buckets that people will commonly think of. But there's a lot of other advisors that are out there. And this what makes me, I'm just going to jump directly into this 10 domains of family wealth model. And the 10 domains family wealth is a model that came out of a family office conference in 2018 in the United States. And I wasn't there, so I'm not entirely sure, but the story I've heard is that there was a session that put a question out to the families that were, family offices that were in attendance. And they were saying that they just felt there was way too much confusion in the wealth management industry. We don't even know what wealth management means, that there was a lack of unbiased education, that whenever somebody would come to them with a presentation, it was because they were selling something, and really just a general lack of transparency in the wealth management industry. And I gather it was really so robust of a conversation that ultimately a number of thought leaders decided that they were going to create a not-for-profit think tank called the Ultra High Net Worth Institute. And you'll see that referenced on the bottom left-hand corner here. And the Ultra High Net Worth Institute is a not-for-profit think tank of a bunch of leaders. And the real goal was to educate and assist families in how they select and work with advisors, as well as providing some professional development for advisors like myself and really supporting change in the industry. We could spend an entire 2 hours probably just on the 10 domains of wealth. But what I want to focus on for us today is that two things. Number one, at the very center of this model is the advisor-client relationship. And that really drives everything else on this in this model. And you need to be, as family members and as advisors, I use this both ways, you need to be, this is a fantastic tool. You're just seeing like the first layer of this, but through Grant afterwards, what I'll do is I'll give him something to circulate to you guys so that you can go in behind the layers and see what all these domains are and what services are in behind them. But for example, estate planning and legal, as you might well imagine, is everything that's related to, you know, what are we going to do around our estates? It's wills, it might be marriage agreements, it'll be trusts, it'll be all that kind of stuff. But we tend to focus, and I did for sure in my prior life, in this whole wealth creation and stewardship cluster. And we're really not spending much time in the other two clusters. So I'm because of the amount of time that we have, I'm not able to go into this in a lot of detail. But what the main takeaway is that there are 9 specialty domains, and within each of those domains, there's the knowledge and the skills that the advisors should have in each of those domains. So as a family member, if you're interviewing advisors and they say, oh yeah, we do everything, this is actually a really good tool for you to say, oh, well, tell me what you do in terms of family dynamics. And when they say, oh, well, we refer that out, then you got to go, well, then you don't do everything, do you? What do you do? Like, we want to know what you do, and specifically how you collaborate and build integrated teams that are going to get the outcomes that we need as a family. So
if there's demand for this, and without putting you on the spot, people, for the audience listening, there's a questionnaire at the end, and if it's something you want to go into, maybe we could get Cindy back in the future at some point to spend more time on it. But
and I can also, Grant, provide you with a link to a podcast on it that the chair of the committee, Jim Grubman, is on, that talks about this, so you get it directly from the horse's mouth. But yeah, we can provide follow-up on that for sure.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get into the creating of this monster. So here we have this little pile of body parts in a big heap. And for many of you, that's probably what your structure feels like right now, is a whole bunch of bits and pieces that, you know, go together somehow, but you're not entirely sure how. This is typically how they end up looking when they come together. So we're going to start with our little monster, friendly monster's big leg on his left-hand side. So there's we'll call that all your debt. You know, debt's not necessarily a bad thing. So that's all your debt there. The long left arm is a very long shareholders agreement, because they usually are very long, and it, as many shareholders agreements do, has a lot of hair on it. So that's the shareholders agreement. The monster's head is your investments, and that's your Genus portfolio manager today, given the recent market volatility. And then bolted on his neck there, that's an insurance policy that somebody somewhere along the way decided would be a good idea. So it, you know, was just kind of there. The torso is the will. It's long as well. It has a lot of scars on it, and it's got some hair on it, and it's pretty pale because it actually hasn't seen the light of day. So there's the will, just waiting to be problematic. The right arm, well, that's a trust. And again, somebody decided at some point, oh, you should have a trust. Never really bothered to go back and look at the shareholders agreement or the wills or any of the other stuff. So it doesn't really fit, but it's there. And in this case, we have a marriage agreement. So that's the right leg. And then you can see exactly how much emotion has gone into this by this little teeny tiny heart at the bottom. So we'll just give our monster that little tiny heart. So this is my monster, and this is the monster that Frank has created. And he didn't intend to create it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to meet Frank's family and spend a little bit of time in the context of Frank's circumstances. These circumstances, whatever your situation is, whether you've got an operating business or you've got any of those other aspects of a family enterprise, the concepts are still going to apply. So don't get so hung up on the fact pattern, but I want you to come at a higher level, and Grant's going to help make sure that we weave that in so that everybody gets what they need out of the presentation. So here we have Frank and his lovely family. When I used to practice as a tax and trust lawyer, I would always start with an organization chart. I now start with a family tree. So this family tree, Frank, as you can see, was married to Sally, and the 2 red slashes mean that they divorced. So Frank and Sally divorced many, many years ago, and Frank had remarried a lovely woman named Susan. Unfortunately, their relationship also broke down, and at the time we meet Frank, they're in the middle. They've just finalized their the divorce terms, but the actual divorce itself is not finalized, and Frank dies suddenly. So that's the scenario with Frank, Sally, and Susan. Let's meet each of the kids. So basically, if we look at this, Sally and Frank had 3 kids: Ruth, Ron, and Rita. So if we start with Ruth, Ruth is married to Bob. They have a really great relationship. Bob's been the sole breadwinner. Ruth has university education, but she's never worked outside of the family. But she does a lot of really great philanthropic stuff. And with Bob's recent retirement, they've decided that they want to travel 4 to 6 months out of the year. And they have 2 lovely daughters, Ellen and Emma. And Ellen is married, and they have 2 kids. So Ron is your stereotypical middle child, and Ron is he did an arts degree. He has moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. He's very happy there. Thank you very much. He gets along with his sisters quite well, but he has no intention of coming back to Canada. And then we have Rita. So Rita is married to happy-go-lucky Doug there. And she also has a university education, but has not worked outside of the home. She's been busy raising their 2 kids. And Doug, as we'll find out in a couple of minutes here, works with Frank. And he's the sole breadwinner for that family. So that's kind of the family tree. Now, Frank has a business, and you might not be surprised to know that his business is called Monsters, Inc., and it makes doors. So Frank started this business many, many years ago, and he was, sort of your sole entrepreneur. And as Monsters, Inc. got, more profitable and busier, he built it up to, we can add zeros. We can say 3 million, 30 million, 300 million, doesn't really matter. But Monsters, Inc. has grown tremendously in value. And he has 1 key employee that's very, very loyal to him and has been with him since the beginning. And he has about 25 other loyal employees. And at the time that Frank died, there were a number of really strategic business decisions that needed to be made. The business was growing dramatically, and they needed to either totally reconfigure their current operations or completely move. And so all of a sudden, unfortunately, Frank died, and he did not have any kind of a succession plan in place other than Doug, his son-in-law, had tried a number of times to talk to Frank about wanting to move up into a more senior role. And Frank just was having what I call the not my son-in-law strategy approach to succession planning. So he'd really done nothing on that front. He also had, there was no insurance on his life. So at the time that he died, remember that we had the divorce in play. And so we have this scenario now where we've got a business with all these strategic decisions that need to be made, no succession plan, and a bunch of employees who are now going to Ellen and Emma, Frank's granddaughters, who work in the business, saying, what's going on? Do I have a job? Is this company going to continue to exist, et cetera? So a lot of dynamics going on there. Then, of course, we have the inevitable family cottage. Frank's cottage has been renovated. It's very lovely. The family used it with Ruth, Ron, and Rita when they were kids. Right now, it's really Rita and Doug that are using it with their 2 kids. But Ellen and Emma are starting to want to use it because there's little ones over on that branch. And so this is starting to cause some tension in the family over who gets to use the cottage. Then we start getting into the will. So a relatively straightforward, fairly common will. We have set up in the will what's called a testamentary trust. So trusts can either be inter vivos, which means created during lifetime, which you would normally probably hear the term family trust, or created in a will, or both. You can have both. And in Frank's will, he has decided that he's going to have a testamentary trust set up that's going to own all the shares of Monsters, Inc. And the trustees and the executors of his estate are going to be Ruth, Ron, and Rita together. They're also going to be the beneficiaries, but they're the beneficiaries as well as a term you'll often see in a will, which is issue, which basically just means the lineal descendants, the bloodline descendants on and on and on into the future. So that's part of Frank's will. The other parts of Frank's will are the cottage. So the cottage is going to be jointly owned by Ruth, Ron, and Rita. And all the other stuff that Frank owns in his family enterprise, including any of those emotional assets we talked about, they're just supposed to figure it out by themselves. And if they can't figure it out, well, just sell it and divide up the proceeds. Which, again, if you think about my gun collection example, I don't know how much the gun would be worth, but the the emotional impact is quite dramatic. Unfortunately, Ruth, Ron, and Rita are completely clueless about this because Dad never talked to them about any of it, didn't get any of their input on what they might want or not want from the estate. And so now they're in a scenario where they are kind of bound in what we call an accidental partnership together in the cottage as co-executors and co-trustees in this little venture. Warren Buffett quote, "Your children are going to read your will someday. It's crazy for them to read it after you're dead for the first time. You are not in a position to answer questions." Okay, so if we were in a workshop, we would be doing breakouts, groups at this point in time, but we don't have that time to do that. So we're just going to blast through some of the things that Frank was maybe thinking. And you'll have other things for sure that you'll come up with. But in terms of things that I thought were pretty more like that came to my mind is that the way he set his will up, he was wanting to pass control to the kids. My question is, why would he want to do that without talking to them? Do all those kids really want control of Monsters, Inc.? He wants to keep the cottage in the bloodline. Again, is this going to make sense with his son-in-law? Probably tax efficiencies, maybe wanted to create a legacy. Well, because he's created this whole trust with issue as beneficiaries, a legacy for G2 and future generations. And probably he wanted to increase the value of, or at least maintain the value of his estate. But we don't really know because he never talked to anybody. So let's have a look at what the monster looks like. Well, there would have been a big decline in business value because there were all these strategic decisions. He's got people quitting. There's not really anybody in charge. He's now got displaced long-term loyal key employees who started to quit, and they're going to lose this business legacy by circumstance rather than by choice. This is a very prominent family in the community, so there was reputational impact. There's no money liquid to pay the divorce settlement. And there was no insurance. So this is problematic. We have the accidental partnership, as I just mentioned. Then you start to get triangulation and mistrust among family members because they'll buddy up behind the scenes and start talking to each other to get support for their own desires and goals, which unfortunately leads to conflict and harm to the relationships and possibly litigation. They'll likely want to or need to unwind everything that Frank put in place, which is time, energy, opportunity costs, and financial costs. And they're probably not going to be very happy with the advisors that got them into this whole mess. So that's all the bad news. The good news is we can actually do this better. So if we had time, I would go through that family tree again, and we would actually figure out this whole family circle piece. And I think Grant mentioned that you guys have or may have had presentations that talked about this before.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many will have remembered it, but it's popped up in a couple of different speakers.
Yeah, so basically this again could be an entire presentation unto itself. For me, two really important things. One is when I'm in a family meeting, I love to use this to help people figure out where exactly they sit in this diagram. So if we think of this as three separate but overlapping systems, the family system, the enterprise, which is often called the business system or circle, and the owners. And depending on where you sit, you would have very different perspectives. So I'll just quickly say, so for example, Frank obviously would be right in the middle of this Venn diagram. So he's a family member who owns the shares of Monsters, Inc. And as such, he'll have a very different perspective from somebody who is just a family member who's not an owner or doesn't work in the business. And he'd have a very different perspective, for example, from a of a family member who worked in the business that isn't an owner. So that might be Doug, depending on how we define family for this family. So Doug worked in the business, but we'll just say he's a family member, but he's not an owner, and he probably wants to be an owner. But nobody ever really had those conversations. The other thing that I've just alluded to is I really like to use this to focus on how does the family want to define family? And is it going to be more inclusive than bloodline? Is it going to include spouses? And how are we going to define spouses, common law partners, other significant relationships? And how are we going to bring family into these conversations? At what point and on what topics? So that's another very big context and conversation to have.
And just for those watching that sort of don't have a family business or family enterprise, that enterprise circle could also just represent financial assets. It could be a portfolio, life insurance, various different things. It doesn't need to be.
Absolutely. So that goes back to Grant, to that very first, or one of the first slides that I put up that said enterprise and had the 9 different blue boxes. And that's why I use enterprise in this circle, whereas most people put business, because that enterprise can include the cottage, it can include everything. And so I prefer that language to be, and for it to be more inclusive, for sure. Thanks for clarifying that. So again, this is a whole topic. I've really not even scratched the surface of it, but we'll just leave that for questions if people have questions. The other concept that I want to introduce, and this goes really back to the slide on the why does this happen, where I said, we don't know how robust these statistics are, but there's a lot more to it than focusing on the quantitative aspects of the wealth. And this comes out of a book called Complete Family Wealth, which I highly recommend. And again, Grant can help you find the reference for that. But very generally, this starts looking at wealth much broader from a qualitative perspective and different types of qualitative wealth. So one is human wealth, and that really gets to the essence of, are all family members thriving emotionally and physically, and are they supporting each other's individual development? Intellectual wealth, is everyone in the family growing intellectually? Does everyone understand their own personal wealth and structures, as well as the family's wealth and structures? From a social wealth perspective, is the family able to communicate with each other about important topics and make shared decisions well? And do they have capable leadership as they start moving into the next generation? There's also something called foundational, or sometimes referred to as spiritual capital. And does the family have a common vision and values that are shared amongst them? And how are they applying those values to their family enterprise and their philanthropy? So we'll come back to that in Q&A, Grant, if people want to. But there's a tool in the book of Complete Family Wealth that has a questionnaire that I ask every family member to use. And it's just on a scale of 1 to 5, and then I aggregate the responses. And so you don't see exactly who said what, so it anonymizes the responses. But I'll often see, for example, that dad will say, oh yeah, like I'm a 5, we totally understand the wealth and structures, and everybody else will be like at a 1. So it's really a great tool to start to identify where maybe there's a bit of divergence in terms of understanding, or where people have different perspectives. There, Frank.
This is what it looks like for anyone who's, but anyone wants to know the details, just let me know. I can let it send it out.
Okay, another quick quote. Assuming what people want is about as controlled as using fireworks to start a fire. And that's really, for me, how we typically approach estate planning and wealth management. We don't have the conversations that we need to have. So how do we do this differently? How do we stop? Yeah.
For a time check, Cindy, if we want questions as well, we've probably got about another 6-7 minutes of talking, and maybe 10 minutes of questions, if that's possible.
Yeah, because we're just getting to my kind of wrap-up slides. That'll leave lots of time for questions. So this is kind of the nuts and bolts of it, so how do we stop doing this? How do we stop this Frankensteining method? and creating this monster so that we actually can create the Michelangelo's David. So because this is an approach that I use, and partly it's because of the background that I've had as a tax and trust lawyer, I actually used to co-author the university textbook on taxation and estate planning in Canada. I've forgotten more than I ever knew, but I know enough to know that I can ask the dumb questions and the questions that other people wouldn't even know to ask. So I figure if I don't understand it, it's probably unlikely that a family member will understand it. Not necessarily always the case, but there's usually at least a few things that I find that I don't understand, or that the family didn't appreciate the impact of some of these clauses, for example, in the shareholders agreement. And I can talk about examples as well, Grant, when we get to Q&A. I'm happy to do that. So what I do is I collect in all the documents. So all these little body parts that we talked about with our monster over here, I'll look at the shareholders agreements, I'll look at the trusts, I'll look at the wills, look at marriage agreements if they're there, work with the investment advisors, the insurance advisors, to make sure that we at least have a picture, a current snapshot of what everything looks like. Working very collaboratively with these other advisors. The goal is not to throw any advisors under the bus, but to say, you know, please, can you help me understand why this works this way? Sometimes it's just helpful for me to learn, and other times it's because there's actually something that needs to be changed because it's been so long since the document was drafted, or there maybe just frankly was an error, because we're all human and people do make mistakes. So so when I do that, I call that a comprehensive key document review. And once I've done that, and I can explain then to, for example, the tax accountant, this is how these documents will work. Can you now do a very high level draft of, if dad died today or mom died today or whoever it was died today, how this would play out on what we call the terminal return, the final tax return. And so it's important to actually do that in the context of the documents, because the documents are going to drive the tax results in many circumstances. So I will give a quick example on that. One situation was fairly specific to agriculture. It was a farming family, and they had a shareholders agreement that had a clause in it that was typical for a non-farming family enterprise business. Unfortunately, the outcome of the way it was drafted resulted in a $5 million tax liability versus a $0 tax liability. And so I went to the accountant who referred me on the file, and I said, can you please double check this? This is my understanding of how this is going to work. He said, yes, you're absolutely right. I said, well, do you want me to talk to the lawyer, or do you want to talk to the lawyer? And he said, no, I'll talk to the lawyer. The lawyer agreed that this was an error, and so it had to be completely redone. But I mean, the important point is that it was caught, and we were able to rectify it. And if anybody had died, we wouldn't have been able to rectify it. So that's why I do that, because there's pretty much always something that I find. There's always something that I find. I do which many of you probably have heard, I interview all family members, families in quotes, because I need you to define family. I always encourage the interview process to include spouses and significant others. That doesn't necessarily mean that they'll come to the first family meeting, but I also pretty much always encourage that. The reason why that's important, I think, should be obvious, but they have an important voice to bring to this process. And if they aren't included, for sure, when you go home and you start talking to them, you're now going to share your experience through your lens rather than them having had their own experience. And so the conversations that you're going to have are going to be very different after where you have that inclusive approach. So I take all that stuff from the interviewing family members, the key document review, and I create a template for a first family meeting. The first part of it is usually education. It's always education, just to try to normalize where we're going with the day. Everybody gets the same information at the same time. Nobody gets a sneak peek at what's coming for the meeting. And I don't do that to be surprised. I just want everybody to get the same information at the same time. And really what we're looking at is, what does our monster look like? And is there anything there that we want to change or tweak? And how do we get to David? So what that looks like for me, as I say, is education. Then I feed back what I've seen in the document review, or I have the financial advisor or the tax accountant or whoever is going to do that. We then also I feed back what I heard in the interviews, again, completely sanitized. So it's not, Grant said this and Cindy said that. And then I take all those intellectual, those quantitative wealth surveys, and I aggregate those so that we can see a comparison of how all the family members responded. So it's a lot of really great information that gets fed to the family. And then I will go around the room and I'll say, okay, Grant, what was one of the top 3 issues? You only get 3. Over the top 3 other issues or things that you thought were amazing that you want to focus on. And he might say, I'm really concerned about some of our agreements, or I'm concerned that we're going to end up fighting. So, we'll write that up on a white flip chart, and then we'll go around the room until everybody's top 3 are represented. And then I give everybody little red voting dots and I say, okay, you got this. We can't boil the ocean. We got to narrow this down to 3 or 4, and people will go around and vote, and it will become very apparent quickly what their top 3 things are that they want to prioritize and get to work on. And then they'll go into breakout groups, again, depending on the size of the family that we're working with. And their goal is to identify clearly what the issue or opportunity is, what next steps they think should be taken, what a successful outcome would look like, and if they need any resources to be able to move the needle on what they want to do. And then they come back and they do a report back to the entire family, and that creates the template for where they want to go forward. And some examples of things that are fairly common that people would like to work on are things like governance, which we haven't talked about at all. They might want to create a family charter. They might be interested in education, doing more education. Philanthropy is another one that often comes up. So I think I'll leave it at that. But basically, the getting better outcomes is really getting a clear understanding of where the family is at now on a broad level, involving all the family members early on, defining what wealth very broadly, not just about the money, helping the family figure out where they want to go as a family, and then really insisting on collaboration, getting away from this silo experience. So Grant, I keep wanting to call you Frank. We've done our speed date, so let's open it up to questions and comments.
Well, that's great, and thank you. And that was so. Just to reiterate, Cindy normally does this in 3 hours, and so that was like drinking from a fire hydrant for many of us, I'd imagine. And just in that vein, so there's a comment or sort of question comment from Georgina here in the chat. So she's asking, she's saying, are you saying stay away from family offices, ? I'm not sure of the point, and it appears to be jumping around. Can you sum up with 5 key points? Now, I think I can try and sum up with 5 key points, and Cindy, you can tell me if I've got this right or not. But I think we often assume that the planning is done for our estate plans, and we've created a Michelangelo, and that's kind of how we go and write a will, do whatever it is we need to do, structures get put in place. And in reality, it might not be the case. And part of that is down to that silo issue. Some of that is because the family is not necessarily included, and so it might not actually end up turning out like you think it will from just doing those different silos. And you need to kind of play things forwards in order to understand that. And if you just stay static and you're paying by the hour or by 6-minute increments planning, and nothing else changes, and you don't play it forwards and you don't have the conversations, then it might not turn out to be the Michelangelo you think it is. So I think that's the point. In terms of family offices, I think that would just come under one of the enterprise assets, or it could be, and that's probably a whole nother topic on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just thanks for doing that. It's a great summary, Grant. On the family offices piece, this is absolutely everybody and their dog is calling themselves a family office. And I have actually had family office people say to me, and we're talking here about multifamily offices, not a single family office, but multifamily offices say we have to call ourselves a family office, because if we don't, we're losing out on branding, because everybody's calling themselves a family office. So to me, that 10 domains of wealth is a really useful tool there. This also takes us into a whole new concept of what's being called Wealth 3.0. And this idea of silos, where really that integration, that's what a family office really can and should be able to do, to be able to integrate, whether it's within their own service offering, or more than likely much broader, that they're working with a select group of other the term trusted advisor is now passé. It's trusted teams. So we don't want to focus on trusted advisor, because again, that just forces us into this silo mentality. So really this idea of trusted teams. But if you think about the circumstance here with Frank, really, he ended up he really had to do his own integration. Right? He had to figure out whether to go to his accountant or to his lawyer or to his wills lawyer or a tax lawyer. That's the typical experience that people have. That was the Charlie experience. I didn't know whether to go to my banker, to my tax accountant, to my investment, whatever it was. It's the client then that ends up having to do the wealth integration. So where we want to move the needle, and where family offices, true multifamily offices, can move that needle, is on that real integration. And there's probably in Canada, I would say maybe 2 that do that really well. And this is acknowledged, and I can send you, again, Grant, a link to a podcast, a really good podcast with Tom McCulloch and Jim Grubman, that talks about this whole issue of integrated wealth and the concepts of family offices. It's a great concept. We're just not doing it really well yet. But nothing gets well at this time.
I think that team concept is a great one, and it's worth mentioning. At Genus, the portfolio managers have always advocated to meet your other advisors, so as we can better understand the situation, and also work with them and try and collaborate as best possible to serve you better. And I think that's something we'd always do. And sometimes, just because we're not paid hourly, people tend to ask us first, and then we would sort of just say, well, we don't know, we need to involve the accountant and set up a meeting, or involve the lawyer. So I think that's something that is going to become more and more important, is that your advisors do work with each other and do talk to each other in order to get the best outcomes for you as clients. So 2 other quick questions we've got here, and I don't know, we'll try and get through these. We assume that Frank died in the case study. Would it have been different if he'd had a stroke and lived?
Oh, yeah, really good question. So, if you've got incapacity, obviously that's going to potentially impact what can be done at that point, what his powers of attorney say, if his will's already in place. That's why these things need to be, you can't just do them and let them sit on a shelf and think something that you did 10 years ago or even 5 years ago is still going to be relevant and appropriate. So this isn't a one and done exercise. We really need to be constantly refreshing.
Yeah, that's great. I do think we are, we spend years of our lives creating wealth and working hard to support our families. And then we kind of figure that we go and get a will done, and in a few hours, it's all neatly taken care of. There's a bit of disconnect on the amount of time we spend trying to create wealth and then actually protect
or the
it.
beneficiaries are going to just figure it out, and that's where you end up in court, right? And
yeah, and that leads nicely to the final question. Any tips on how to protect family wealth from a spouse or a common law partner? I think I'm thinking of a new marriage and don't know how it would work out, but there was no prenup.
Oh, yeah.
So Dina asked that question. Yeah, we had one. The last webinar was on family law and around some of this, okay. So it's worth going back to that. But from your aspect, Cindy, I don't know.
Yeah, often there isn't a prenup, but there's what we call in Alberta, we call them postnups. So you still can put those type of agreements in place even after you're married. One of the things, this is a really sensitive issue, of course, with families. And I would say it's one of the best opportunities when you do family governance, when you have family governance conversations and you start talking about family charters, because you get ahead of those things. So in other words, you would actually, many families will draft right into their family charter that family members are expected to get a marriage agreement, co-have agreement, whatever it is, prenup, postnup. And then it's just an expectation. And you can actually build into your charter what are the consequences of you not having that document in place. Then it just becomes a non-issue, right? Because it's an expectation go forward. People will often say, yeah, but my sister didn't have to get one, so now why should I have to get one? Well, okay, tit for tat, but she can still get one, right? But something, so you want to get ahead of, you just want to get ahead of it for the next generation, even if you can't get the current generation on board. And the other thing, Grant, I'll just say quickly on that is I've also had families build into their charter that they will pay for the independent legal advice for the incoming partner because they often don't have the financial means to afford the lawyer to be able to get the independent legal advice that is required to have a legally binding marriage agreement.
I think that's the number one way to shoot down a prenup is if there wasn't an independent lawyer made available to the other party and often used. So well, we've kind of run out of time. We'll try and get back to any other questions that are there, but really, I just want to say thank you to Cindy, and we are making a donation on behalf of Cindy to Doctors Without Borders, and just want to express our thanks and gratitude for everybody taking the time to attend the webinar today. So we do have our next webinar coming up on June the 23rd, aligning your investments with your values, and that registration should be coming out in a short time. If you would like to stay on the browser, don't close the browser down, please, at the end of this, and you'll be redirected to a questionnaire. And feel free in there if you'd like to have an interest in that 10 domains of wealth as well. And we can see if we can twist Cindy's arm or somebody else to come back and explain a bit of that at some point too. With that, have a great day and thank you very much.